Salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever or wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here right now, this evening, to say something about the symbiont. What is the symbiont, and why does it matter? Well, let's see if I can answer my own questions. This time I'm not just asking for a friend, I'm asking myself. And let's see how it comes out. To start out, let's just take a look at the word, symbiont. Now, I've constructed this word, but it's obvious where it's taken from, the word symbiosis. So what does symbiosis mean? It means living together. Sym, together or combined, and biosis. So what is symbiosis? Well, it's something you see all through the natural world, and it is simply the activity of different species of animals and insects, reptiles, birds, and also different species of plants living together. Now, if you look at a beautiful spring meadow, you see many different species. Different plants, you see daisies, mushrooms, herbs. You also see different birds congregating in the meadow and in the trees. Robins, sparrows, crows. And then you also see different insects. So there are earthworms, there are grasshoppers, ants, and all of these creatures are different, unique species. Now you will notice, if you observe the behavior of these creatures, that each species has its own sphere of activity. It has its own typical area of behavior, which is bounded in a particular way. This is called the morphic field or morphogenetic field of that species. So all robins have a morphic field, and they all cooperate in it together, and they all behave in a similar way. And the robins have a certain kind of language and a certain song, which is different from the language of the crows, because the crows are operating, behaving in a different morphic field. So all the animal species, all the insects, the ants, the butterflies, the bees, have their own morphic fields, and they operate as a unity. Call it a hive mind, if you like. All the bees operate according to the same mind, which is the living intelligence of the morphic field of the bees. And it goes on and on, into thousands and thousands of examples. If there's a pond by the meadow, well, you see the turtle. You see the water bugs on the surface of the pond, the fish in the pond. Maybe you see geese flying over. The geese are flying in a V formation that is typical of their behavior in their morphic field. The turtles behave in a certain way. If there are beavers at one end of the pond building a dam, they operate according to the morphic field of the beavers. So it's easy to see that all of these different living creatures have their own individual morphic fields. But that's not all that you see, because in fact, they are all living together in the natural environment. Now, there may be some instances of competition between species. Different species of birds can quarrel with each other. But on the whole, the different species behaving according to their morphogenetic fields cooperate with each other. And that is called symbiosis, or living together. So what you see in nature is a grand, magnificent, spectacular display of symbiosis. What then is the symbiont? It is the symbiont. Well, the symbiont is a name for the divine power, the divine designing intelligence that has installed in the natural world this ability for different species to cooperate and live together. That's the symbiont. It's an agent of a supernatural dimension which has acted upon the natural world in such a way as to set up all the transactions of symbiosis, which can be called interspecies activity. The behavior, the relationship of one species to another. So you have those two distinct ideas. How animals behave, say, mockingbirds or hummingbirds within their own morphic field, and then how they behave in an interspecies way, relating to other species. And there are countless examples, some of them wonderful, most of them very wonderful and amazing, of interspecies relations. So the symbiont is, by definition, the agent that has produced and set up the whole field of interspecies relations. That is the symbiont. Now, it's natural that those who come across my work for the first time, or maybe not even the first time, will find a certain challenge in getting the terms I use and knowing how I use them. So I want to make one thing clear. When I talk about the divine or the supernatural, I talk about something that is materially present in the cosmos. It's not immaterial, but it belongs to the inner depths of the material world. And so you don't normally encounter the supernatural directly. What you encounter in the natural world, including your own presence on the planet and your behavior as a member of a species, what you encounter is the emergence of what is produced from the supernatural. The supernatural is the source or origin of the natural. Now here, I refer you to the Sophianic narrative of the mysteries, the fallen goddess scenario, which is also called the home story. This is a narrative about life on Earth, the origins of the planet itself, and the origins of the human species and of all species. And in the language of this narrative, one of the first things to be learned is that the supernatural and divine powers who have, I don't like to use the word created because it's not correct, who have emanated this world through their abilities as gods, are called the aeons. So there are these godlike beings called the aeons, and they are great serpents of light, and they are serpentine currents of force, plasmic currents. That's the way to define them in modern language. So according to the animistic perspective that I teach, in the Sophianic myth, you learn that at the core of our galaxy, there are the aeons. They dwell in the core, and they are vast plasmic currents, and they are alive. They have will, they have senses, they have intention, they have emotions. They are living creatures, but they do not take an anthropomorphic form, although it's convenient to compare them to great serpents, great celestial serpents. And Sophia is one of these serpents. The symbiont is another one. So without getting too technical, the point is that the symbiont is a divine, supernatural agency that has played a role, a key role, in the organization of life on Earth, in the natural environment. If you want to learn more about the symbiont, then go to the home story on sophianicmyth.org and subscribe, and you'll get the 9 chapters, the 9 episodes of the story once every 3 or 4 days, and you can read the entire narrative. Regarding the narrative, by the way, there is one point I would advise. When you come to the narrative and you read the fallen goddess scenario in its totality, what you find is that it is a cosmological story. It's a myth on the galactic scale that explains who Gaia Sophia was before she became the Earth, the prehistory of the Earth, and it explains how she turned into the Earth. So when you get to the 9th and last episode in that narrative, humanity has not yet appeared on the Earth. The other species have appeared. The natural world is there. But the human species has not yet appeared at the end of that narrative. Okay? And so one may naturally wonder, well, what's the point in learning all about that? Well, that's a long story, complicated myth. I prefer to say complex and elegant myth. And it describes all these things that happened in this galaxy before we even appeared on the Earth and before the Earth itself even appeared. And what's the point of knowing all that? It's so remote. It's so far away. The point is, and this is something that can only be confirmed by learning the narrative. I can't prove it to you theoretically. The point is that everything that happened in that long narrative, the biography of the mother planet, plays forward into life today. Every single incident and every single detail in those distant times of millions of years ago works upon the world now and plays into the way that we experience our environment, the natural habitat, and the way that we, as different races of one species, relate to each other. So my point here is to tell you what the symbiont is for you now, today, regardless of whether you know the cosmological background of the fallen goddess scenario. So let's see if I can do that. I'm intrigued to see if I can pull that off. In order to know, actually know, because the Gnostic knows, the Gnostic does not believe. In order to know how the symbiont is present in your life today, there is one thing that you have to consider: the Symbiont Equation. There's an equation, a simple proposition to be learned. And by reflecting on this proposition, you can come to know what I'm talking about. You can come to know the living reality of the symbiont. The Symbiont Equation is sort of like a mathematical equation, but a simple one. In fact, it's a simple statement of proportion. If you put it in abstract language, it sounds like this: A is to B as B is to C. So there are 3 elements, 3 components in the Symbiont Equation: A, B, C. But the second component is repeated twice. A is to B as B is to C. So when you take that mathematical formula and you convert it into language, that's the equation. And it sounds like this: Your self-love is to your sense of humanity as your sense of humanity is to your empathy with non-human animals. Simple enough, right? Simple and elegant, I would say. But I guarantee you something, my friends, that the first time you hear that equation, and even after you hear it or recite it several times, you will not be able to understand that equation. The properties of the Symbiont Equation are unique, they are special, and they are based on something deeply embedded in the human psyche. And although the equation takes you directly to that deeply embedded factor, it's not immediately clear how it does so. But it does take you there. I guarantee you that. So the equation is not something to be understood merely in an intellectual sense. In fact, it can't really be understood in just an intellectual sense. It has to be deeply felt. You have to take it into yourself and reflect on it. And savor it. Savor the language. And let it sink in to the deepest part of your human self. Now let's look at the three components. First component is your self-love. To work the equation, I think I'll call it that, you need to work the equation to get the result of it. You have to reflect on what is your self-love. Do you have self-love? Do you innately possess something that can be called self-love? And if you do, how does it feel? Do you know it when you feel it? Let's say that self-love is a property of the human animal, and in particular, it is a property of the psyche of our species, the anthropine species. But obviously, that factor is not the same for everyone. So even though it is a universal component, you can say it's in the factory installation of the human psyche, not everyone feels it or registers it in the same way. But I'm assuming that you do register something in yourself when I say your self-love. It's a feeling, isn't it? It's not just a feeling, but it is primarily a deep, deep feeling. Second component, your sense of humanity. Now separate this component for a moment from the first one, A. This is B, your sense of humanity. Well, what does that language say to you? What is your sense of humanity? Well, if you reflect on it, I think you'll find that it consists of two aspects. One aspect is you sense your own humanity, and the other aspect is you sense the humanity of others. So it's not just one or the other. It's both of those aspects. Your sense of humanity applies to you yourself, and it also applies to the way you view others, the way you treat them, the way you respond to them. So stop for a moment and just reflect on your sense of humanity. Basically, I would advise that your sense of humanity is, again, a deeply embedded feeling in every human animal. But it can be cultivated. So your sense of humanity, the sense of humanity, can be stronger and richer and more conscious in certain people than it is in others. So ask yourself, do you feel and know in some innate way that you, as a single living human person, belong to humanity? So you have humanity in yourself. Do you know, do you think, do you consciously understand that you are actually a member of a species? Look at a dog. A dog is a member of the canine species. Look at a bird. A bird is a member of the avian species, of which there are thousands. Look at a lion. A lion is an animal, an individual animal, who is a member or example of the leonine species. And you are a member of the human species, and your sense of humanity is exactly that, to feel that you belong and know in some way that you belong to that species. Normally, of course, one doesn't speak of humanity as a species comparable to other animals. But Gnostics do. Gnostics do consider humanity in this way. Now look at the other aspect of your sense of humanity. That operates externally. It goes outward in your gaze. It goes outward in your expressions to other people. When you approach another human individual or a group of people, or when you stand in a mass of people in a public setting, what is your sense of humanity doing? Does it allow you to identify that those other people are like you, that they share in common with you the same identity as a species? How does it work? Examine yourself. Reflect on that. Think about your sense of humanity in those two aspects. A is to be as B is to C. Your self-love is to your sense of humanity as your sense of humanity is to your empathy with non-human animals. C. Your empathy with non-human animals is the C in the equation of the symbiont. Now, if you reflect on it, and if you look into this proposition, and you see how it's constructed, you'll see that the very construction of the language poses a question to you. I would say that the equation leads you to a question. It takes you somewhere. And unless you can bring that question into conscious consideration, then you don't really get the equation. So what is the question? It's quite simple, really. What is the relationship between your sense of humanity, that is how you feel about yourself as a human animal and others, what is the relation of that to the way you feel about non-human animals? Your empathy for non-human animals, like cats and dogs and tigers and lions and elephants and whales and bumblebees and anacondas. Do you have a feeling for non-human animals? I'm going to confine the meditation, if you want to call it that, to the category of two-legged and four-legged creatures. So let's just talk about bears, dogs, cats, horses, those kind of animals. Let's just consider the animals that you may have contact with in the course of life, normally, ordinarily. Do you feel empathy for those animals? They're not members of the human species. They belong to many, many other species. So we're talking about, you got it, interspecies relationship. You have an interspecies relationship to all other animals who are not human. And how do you feel about that? How do you feel when you interact with these other animals? Do you have empathy for them? Do you have affection and respect for them? Do you treat them with respect? Do you perhaps in some cases come to know those animals and to love them deeply in a way that might be compared to the love you feel for other humans? Reflect on that. Reflect on that third component in the equation. Now go back to the question. How does your sense of humanity relate to your empathy with non-human animals? It's a strange question, isn't it? Have you ever formulated that question before? In those exact terms? Maybe you have. So that is the question that I offer you now for your reflection, for your consideration. If you consider the Symbiont Equation correctly, in the right way, it takes you to that question. And it also does something else as well. It takes you to a challenge. It contains a challenge. Because what does it imply, finally, if you think it through, savor it, feel it emotionally? What does it imply? It implies something totally, totally outrageous. It implies that you can only know and measure your sense of humanity on the standard of your empathy for non-human animals. It implies that your sense of humanity cannot be complete and cannot be grounded totally in your human self unless you hold it up to a standard. And the standard is your empathy for non-human animals. It follows then, several other inferences follow from this proposition. The first one that comes to mind is this. Well, if your empathy for other animals is weak, and you don't have much feeling for them, and you don't respect them and feel affection for them, then your sense of humanity is low grade. Remember, your empathy for non-human animals is the standard for measuring your sense of humanity. Now, it's fact, and there's plenty of evidence of it, that there are huge numbers of people around the world who don't have a lot of empathy for non-human animals. There are cultures where there is almost no empathy for non-human animals. And what I say to you is that the Symbiont Equation shows that being so, the sense of humanity in those cultures and populations is weak and substandard. And it's true that countless millions of people on this planet are operating at a substandard level in their sense of humanity. You cannot have a healthy, strong, integral sense of humanity in reference to your own humanity and the humanity of others unless you have an equal sense of feeling toward non-human animals. That's the standard. That's the challenge that comes when you reflect on the equation of the symbiont. So I'll just leave it at that. Although I will conclude with a little tease. Just a little tease. The sacred narrative says that the symbiont came to the earth at a certain moment when Sophia had turned into the earth, and at a moment when her planetary body was erupting with all different sorts of species, all the plants, all the animals, the reptiles, the insects, the birds. And the symbiont came into that situation to assist the planetary animal mother in organizing all of those life forms so that they would behave in symbiotic totality, as they do, as you see. And the story says, the myth says, it adds a really mysterious detail. And it says that when the symbiont departed and left the earth, went back to the galactic center, it left a fragrance on the earth. So you can detect the symbiont by the presence of a fragrance. And this fragrance is a really mysterious, baffling element in the Sophianic narrative. What could this possibly mean? That there is a fragrance on the planet that permeates all life. And is it possible for human animals to detect this fragrance? What is the fragrance of the symbiont? What is the fragrance of symbiosis? Have you ever felt it? Would you know that you were feeling it? I'll leave you with that riddle, but I'll also leave you with a fragrance. Think of something that smells sweet. What plants, what flowers smell sweet? Flowers have many different aromas. I would not say, for instance, that roses necessarily smell sweet, although there is a kind of sweetness in the odor of roses. In my mind, a plant that really smells sweet is honeysuckle or gardenia. In the odors of those plants, there is something that you can call sweetness. But hold on a moment. And what about animals? What about cats, for instance? Have you ever had the experience of picking up a cat and showing it affection and breathing the smell of the cat, or of a dog, or of a horse? And somehow, you would say to yourself, without having to define it, that's such a sweet smell. Is that the fragrance of the symbiont? Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.